Good afternoon. Welcome to everyone. I hope you're all well. We are on day 2 and session 2 of our research into the Grooming Gang scandal. Last time we covered the If Only Someone Had Listened report on child sexual abuse, or CSE as you may hear it referred to in the stream. We covered the group definition, the gang definition that the government is using. We covered the people who are responsible for looking out for these kids. They're called LSCBs. We found out about them. And all the different ways in which they failed. 94% of them failed to make adequate child sexual exploitation protection requirements back in 2014. We will, when it comes to whether or not things have been successful or are working towards becoming successful, come back to this and look at everything that's happened in the last 5 years. But at the moment we're still building a more complete historical picture as much as we can, and to that extent we need to go backwards, not forwards. A couple of things which we didn't expect to find. It worked out that the search criteria for the search criteria for the police in order to find victims or perpetrators was missing girl, Asian male. However, they didn't appear to have appear to be cognizant of any other ethnicities taking part. So I'd be curious to see to what degree that has also been covered up as well, because I suspect that the white perpetrators are not necessarily just run-of-the-mill people from the local community. I suspect that they are quite likely to be either higher-ups in the police force, social services, and beyond, or they will be people of note, celebrities, etc., as we saw with things like the Jimmy Savile scandal, but that's purely speculation. We don't know that yet. If you're interested, everything that we do find out from these research streams goes into a document called Atrocity Findings. You'll find the link to that in the description. Hopefully it's already there. If I just had to double check the description, yes, we've got that in there. Good evening and good afternoon, Immaterial, Clean Your Lobster, and Autochath. Nice to see you. Right. We are going to go through today a few articles that we've discovered that are in my little research document here as part of the cover-up. So we're going back. We're not at Rotherham. We're in Oxford for some of it as well. Right. So we have this first article. As a Rotherham Grooming Gang survivor, I want people to know about the religious extremism which inspired my views. This is from March 2018. Although what I'm more interested in this case study, although we will come to it, is this one actually. That the Home Office had information on the grooming gangs in 2002 and failed to act. So I'm pretty sure the J report is the preliminary report that ran up into the If Only Someone Had Listened 2013 report. The J report came out a year earlier, it looks like. Okay. So the government received information detailing the extent of grooming gang activity as far back as 2002. And I think the person who primarily brought this to bear was a woman named Jane Senior, who was operating in the area from 1997 to 2012 herself. And there was a program that she ran called... Now, what was it called? It wasn't the See Me, Hear Me campaign, because that was a newer one. But she ran a campaign into CSE. We'll be hoping to speak to her once we've done all the general data collection. The National Crime Agency's ongoing investigation found that over 1,500 young girls and young women were abused between 1997 and 2013. Right, so let's see if we can grab this. More than 1,500 people. I want Alexis J's report. This is the trouble where independent links to itself and not to the sources which it's actually claiming. Alexis J. Found children who have been doused in petrol, threatened with being set alight, threatened with guns, made to witness brutally violent rapes. 3 reports from 2002 to 2006 highlighted the exact extent of child exploitation. Right. I want your sources. You don't provide your sources. Okay. Right. Let's find the J report, shall we? Let's have a look. Independent inquiry. Is this the one? Yes. Marvellous. Afternoon, Davey. Afternoon, King Your Lobster. And Carsoni, nice to see you. Yeah. So, this is the report which was undertaken by Alexis J. It's also, as I say, I'm pretty sure Jane Senior was involved with part of the data collection. I don't want to leave her out of it. And how many pages? 159. So this looks like this is our work for the evening. Given that this is going to be talking about reports. So, yeah. So the 2009 to 2013 period, we covered the 2011 to 2013 period yesterday. 1997 to 2009, okay. So they were looking into the government, over 100 interviews. Okay. Chronology of key events. This is going to be very important to us. Let's get through the executive summary first. No one knows the true scale of it. This is Rotherham specifically. So the previous report we looked at was at child sexual exploitation nationwide, and the failings of LSCVs to basically do anything about it, even the ones at risk, were failing to meet their targets 94% of the time in terms of the standards and protections for children. And in just over a third of cases, children affected were known to a service because of neglect and child protection issues. They were raped by multiple perpetrators, trafficked to other towns and cities in the north, abducted, beaten, intimidated. There are examples of children doused in petrol, threatened with being set alight, threatened with guns, made to witness rapes, brutal violence, threatened that they would be next if they told anyone, and this happened to girls as young as 11. Fuck. Okay. It's not confined to the past, it still continues. The caseload of specialist child... So there's a... Okay, the caseload of the CSE team was 51 cases in May. More cases held by other children's social care teams. 16 looked after children were identified in social care as being at serious risk, and 157 reports have been received in 2013 concerning child sexual exploitation in the borough itself. I want to find out what's the population 2013. It's 258,000 people, okay, roughly. And it's about the same, 250 to 260,000 people. It's been a very stable population. That's very helpful for us. And where have I put this? There it is. Absolutely horrific. We are looking at 157 reports in 1 year. So, over the 12 years, the collective failures were blatant. Noting, of course, that this 157 reports is just the reports, not the prevalence. Because why would you tell anyone if you're terrified? You've witnessed your friends, family, and potentially other people being brutally raped by your abusers. You don't trust the system, and they're covering up. Why on earth would you report it? At an operational level, the police gave no priority to CSE. They regarded many child victims with contempt. They failed to act on their abuse as a crime. Further evidence was in 2002, 3 and 6. 3 reports known to the police and council, which could not have been clearer in their description. The first reports was suppressed because senior officers disbelieved the data, leading to suggestions of cover-up. 2 other reports set out the links between CSE, drugs, guns, and criminality. These were also ignored. So, in the early 2000s, a small group of professionals monitored large numbers of children known to be involved or at risk of CSE, but they were given little or no help or support. Senior levels seemed to think that the extent of the problem was exaggerated and seemed intent on reducing the official numbers of children categorized. Again, we see bureaucracy at work. Aside from anything else, they want to have the target, we're a crime-free borough, right? Staff were overwhelmed by the numbers involved. From 2007 onwards, the management improved, but it's still acutely understaffed and overstretched. After the events of... after a seminar and the 3 reports, given in 2004 to 5, no one could say they didn't know. In 2005, the present council leader chaired a group to take forward the issues, but there is no record of its meetings or conclusions apart from 1 minute. By far the majority of perpetrators were described as Asian by victims. Councillors did not engage directly with the Pakistani community to discuss how they could jointly address the issue. Some councillors seemed to think it was a one-off problem which they hoped would go away. Several staff described their nervousness about identifying the ethnic origins of perpetrators for fear of being thought racist. Nothing we don't know already. In 2009, the Minister for State for Children and Families put the Council's Children's Safeguarding Services into intervention, following an extremely critical Ofsted report. We'll try and find that at some point. This council was removed 13 months later. Why? Rotherham Safeguarding Children Board and its predecessor oversaw the development of good interagency policies. They rarely checked, though, whether or not they were actually being implemented or working. Great. This is found lacking. Over the last 4 years, noting, of course, this is between 2009 and 2014, this later period, though this report only goes up to mid-2013, some supplementary evidence from 2014. The last 4 years have been improving. Now, well-resourced, well-trained, but prosecutions are low. Again, this actual low number of prosecutions will be multifaceted. It's not a univariate thing. It's not necessarily just racism. It's also the nature of rape in general and the insidious way in which it's taking place. There is now a central team, and they're still there. Okay, let's have a look. Alright, I didn't even need to look up the population. They got that for me. It's got an 8% black and minority ethnic community, and nearly a quarter of properties are council houses. It now does light engineering and technology, but they're still deprived, and their unemployment's very high. I wish they'd told us what that unemployment rate was. See if we can find out, shall we? Other unemployment figures. 2013. Here we are, I think. This will probably be it. Let's find unemployed. I always hate when they use alternate unemployment measures. Looks like roughly 2013, nearly 9%. Between, if we take the September figure, about 7.5 if we average out these two alternate ones. Less, it's going to give me a bit more extra information. Reset that. I'm just looking at the tables, just trying to see if I can find... Like, they've got lots of little breakdowns, but I'm just trying to find the aggregate figure. But I mean... It's unclear to me whether or not this figure is 3 types of classification, as opposed to something else. So it's like claimant count and alternative claimant count. Is an alternative claimant count another group, or is it another way of measuring claimants? See if we can find out, shall we? What is an alternative claimant? Right. So the number of people claiming unemployment benefits. So it's a different figure. Okay. Marvellous. Sorry about that, my internet went out for a second. They were on to us, clearly. British Knight. Afternoon. Thank you very much for your message. Andrew, in chat, I appreciate what you're saying. I'm making a video report, but this is going to be a 2-month, probably a 2-month project, at least, where we go through everything, collate everything. The reason that I'm doing this in a stream thing is, first of all, to keep me accountable to yourselves, but also in order to bounce things off people. It's no problem. I understand this is not for everybody. This is definitely a quieter and drop in and drop out type of stream. Apologise for the traffic outside as well. Hopefully we'll be there. Right, where were we? J report. we know that roughly 7.5% unemployment, and that comes from, where is it? This one? No. This... In 2013, yes. Why is that not saved? Give me. Copy, paste. There we go. Works better. My chat is being infuriating for me. Right. Metropolitan Borough of Rural, Council is 63 elected members, 49 Labour. It's a Labour Council. 57 Labour, 4 Conservative, 1 UKIP, 1 Independent. Until 2004, CSE was with what was called the Area Child Protection Committee. Then it changed to the LSCBs. So, okay. So LSCBs have been active since 2005. That's a good thing to know. These took over from Area Child Protection Committees. The ACPB, ACPC in 2005. First council service was the first council service to develop CSE risky business. Right, so that's the one by Jane Senior. She ran that. Founded in 1997, worked between 11 and 25, and was basically supposed to be basic sexual education, health advice, etc. And then it was beginning to identify... I like this, by the late 90s. It started in the late 90s. Anyway, it began to identify vulnerable girls. Its relationship with any young person was voluntary on both sides, so it wasn't mandated by the council or anything, and was part of the youth services. It provides training to magistrates, the police, schools, and foster carers as well. Okay. So let's pop in the Risky Business Youth Project. Jane Senior, who's going to be associated with that. And that was a Rotherham thing. Okay. So we'll note that so that we can find it later. Sexual exploitation of young people was recognised as an okay, what's this? Within children's social care, the sexual exploitation of young people was first recognised as an executive director in 2001, although there were many known cases of CSE in the years before then. Risky Business would refer young people to social care who they had serious concerns about, and they would require interventions. And they did a research pilot to find out the most effective approaches to street prostitution, presumably stopping street prostitution, right? Local agencies challenged this draft report, questioned its evidence base, while it commended training and fostering. They criticised the police and local authority. Social work with the victims of CSE were undertaken through Child Protection Unit. but it wasn't developed until the early 2000s. But don't worry, everyone, they held strategy meetings. Then they changed everything in 2005. To create a new department. Okay. Police were undertaking operations designed to investigate CSE. And they also had this Operation SAR, but that was not till 2009. And they basically were realizing that people were abducting, men were abducting children, and they didn't manage to get any convictions, and only 11 arrests in a follow-up operation. Right. We'll have to find that. Remember when the wife of the Stockholm bomber was arrested in Luton and there were protests over it? Do you think the Home Office covered it up, as protests might have put a stop to mass immigration? I don't know anything, unfortunately, about it. But I'm sure we'll have to get to it. But it wouldn't surprise me. Let's see if we can get to... This is basically them saying that everything was obfuscated. The committee was subject to a committee which had a strategy meeting with another department. Ofsted invalidated X, Y, and Z. Reports were produced. But it's important, we can come back to these if we need to, because we might want to have a look at one of the external reports on children's services later on. Okay. Chronology. So, again, we've made our way back now to 1997. But we want to go back further. It's unclear whether or not the first set of arrests took place as early as 1975, 1985, or 1991. From what I've read further afield, so we're going to have to make that clearer. Just double checking no one's joining me on this particular project. Okay. They released draft guidance. They kept calling the children prostitution. Children involved in prostitution, even though it's not prostitution. Communication from South Yorkshire Police. Again, we'll be looking into them, because they're the ones who are obviously responsible for a lot of this. Council maintain their funding. Okay. I'm going to just summarise this, right? Risky Business was a project set up in 1997 that ran until 2012. We'll see whether or not it continues to this day, actually. But let's go back here. Initially funded from... initially self-funded with council assistance, but became council-funded as of... where is it here? 2001. Meetings took place between the police, chief exec, and senior staff. A report on runaway children. Okay. Chronology of Rotherham. Right, I'll give this its own heading. Round 2 indeed, Luke and Vienno. Let us meet to plan our strategies for our plans and strategies for all committees here. So. The only things we're interested in, South Yorkshire Police defined CSE victims as child prostitutes. That was in 1999. Same year, Home Office releases guidance to prevent CSE. Again, committees, subcommittees. I'm not seeing any of this being implemented. But what I'm interested in is, and the things that I'm collating is, they're releasing specific guidance. So, this is something which just blocks the idea that people didn't know. And it's just another report that comes out, explains the problem. Sexual exploitation, drug use, and drug dealing in South Yorkshire. Right, let's get that. Report is released. Change everything. Sexual Exploitation Forum is established in 2003. And in 2004, we have a presentation, a series of presentations were made to these groups. An action plan was called for. You notice that it wasn't actually made, but it was called for. And again, none of this is involving getting the police to find and convict more. The Task and Finish group, which was established here, decided they would arrange a seminar and do a publicity campaign. Okay. A task force is established. 2005. Task force runs a campaign to raise awareness. As if everyone wasn't already aware that it was going on in a community as well. It's like the risks of sexual exploitation. Again, it doesn't sound to me like there's a reason sexual exploitation is exploitation. This is not people going out and getting pimped. This is children being stolen from homes and raped. Telling young parents to protect their child against being stolen away in the night is not great PR. mid-2005, 30 of their... Now, how many members did it say at the top? We'll get back to the chronology, but they have... Councillors. Because there are quite a few. Here we are. 63 elected members. So only half of them attended. So... "47 Labour councillors," right. It's just important for later, probably. Stranger danger. Alright. A group would consider child safety, witness protection, and safe travel issues around licensing and taxis. Again, taxis keep coming up. 2005, first direct mention of council awareness of taxi driver or taxi usage. CSE would be a principal theme in the 3-year community safety strategy. They created a new department. Right. Yeah. 5. Department, which was the Children and Young People's Services. Created to tackle CSE. And other social services. They looked at 87 cases. They were also dealing with over 90 cases ongoing. The chair of the Children and Young People's Voluntary Sector wrote to the Chief Exec asking how the task of Finnish Group had progressed and offering to contribute. Couldn't find a reply. Right, 2006. Conference on CSE held. Funding to risky business increased. More people were assigned. There was another one which was established to investigate young boy abuse. Another 70 victims were found. Council members attended a training seminar. What we're interested here is 2007 December. The Sexual Exploitation Forum, which was established 4 years previously, heard that risky business was inundated with referrals, all of them under 18 years old. Some were looked after children, and the project was under pressure from those who referred them, which is good. That'll be the homes, presumably. Well, it appears at Heron's War that the one group that actually managed to achieve things was Risky Business, but all the others are just increasing awareness, a publicity campaign. A new department has been set up to better manage the resources going towards your other projects. The Sexual Exploitation Forum, again, is a self-report measure that is receiving information from voluntary sources. It's not going out and collecting data itself. All of that was done by Risky Business, right? Nothing is... The police are clearly not doing their job either. The first 5 were convicted in 2008. First 5 men convicted as a direct result. Of the Sexual Exploitation Forum's findings. Funding increased for Risky Business. Again, not that we're allowed to know how much, apparently. And so it took 4 years. So they're receiving an annual report, right? The LSCB is receiving an annual report on CSE. Again, the main service is Risky Business, and appears to be doing some decent stuff. Nothing but respect for them. But they finally started investigating the businesses which are doing this. Okay. They replaced the executive director. He wanted more project information. They were externally assessed and rated inadequate because the safety of children could not be assured. Right. And this was again 2009. They replaced the chief exec again, just literally a year later, less than. Then Operation Tsar. They revoked taxi licenses but didn't convict anyone. Okay. So it looks like we'll be going into Operation Tsar later on as well. This would be 2010. I'm gonna bold this up so I can find it later. A lessons learned review was commissioned. They finally set up a subgroup for CSE in 2011. 2010 again, sorry. They had a trial with 5 convictions on the second operation, called Operation Central. But a child was murdered. Operation Shard began 2011. Something to also come back to. They managed to convict the murderer. Okay, so that's a big deal. Okay, let's go back slightly. So in 2010, an unnamed child, coded child S, was murdered. This is a big deal. And in 2011, child S's murderer was convicted and sentenced to 17.5 years, which is not very many. And occasionally, review into child S's murder takes place. Not sure what's going on outside. And in 2012, the review is published, and accused of data cover-ups by the Times. Is it the Times? Yeah. Stop streaming from the middle of the road. Sorry, man. I live next to a building site. It's a miracle nothing's going on there. Operation K Alphabet. And a second Operation Kappa. Operation Kappa began. Oh, yeah. Ofsted improved the rating. They began looking specifically at Eastern European children who were at risk. So we're now the later part. Okay. (2013) report on the handling of CSE was published, and 2014 we have the J report published. Good. I appreciate this is very dull for a lot of people. You don't have to be here if you don't want to be. going to be a lot of trawling through people trying to hide things in walls of text. So going into things in more detail, in 2003, the Social Services Inspectorate SSI found that I'm going to try and get rid of as much of the jargon as I can. Okay. So referral and assessment teams are responding too slowly and inappropriately to some child protection referrals. Right. Referral services failed to keep up with referral demands and blocked others inappropriately. Assessments were not completed on time, we've already covered that. And they didn't draw on other agencies. Failed to draw on multi-agency resources. Referral services failed to hold their own conferences on child protection. Risk assessments were poorly completed and inaccurate. Urgent action was needed. Child protection strategies were ineffective, disjointed, and unclear. Thanks, British Knight. I'm glad you enjoy it as background noise, I guess. And yeah, thanks for the sub every month. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I love how the management section is pure management hell as well. Performance management, information systems and quality assurance arrangements did not identify the lapses which were occurring. Management was incompetent and didn't know what was going on. Individual casework and decision making must be more carefully monitored. Well, you can never be too carefully monitored, now can it? Management information was not routinely used to assess performance as part of a performance management culture, so they didn't conduct reviews of their own performance. Monitoring gave... Yeah, let's get some of this down. Services failed to assess conduct performance assessments. You wonder how much of this is they'd rather be decried as incompetent rather than complicit, right? Even though ignorance is not the same as innocence. Okay. Failed to conduct performance assessments. Failed to demonstrated an acute lack of awareness and incompetence. More staff should attend training in equal opportunities, racial awareness, complaints and customer care. That sounds a bit dodgy to me. Staff are not sufficiently skilled to deal with the complexity of referrals. Staff were under or poorly trained. The structure of case files should be reviewed to promote effective work with children. Records were not or poorly kept. Parents were prevented, not notified, conferences, and denied access to reports. A racial equality scheme had been published and an ethnic minorities development worker appointed. However, the quality of data on gender and ethnicity was uneven. What does that statement even mean? Uneven. Does that mean that the disproportionate number of Asian men, according to the victims, were being identified as the perpetrators? Was an uneven split? Data collection was inadequate. You never would have guessed it from a government body, would you? I assume Child S's murderer is out now. We don't know. It's 17.5 years that were given in... Where was it? 2011? So it'll be out in 2028. It wasn't a crash, I had to blow my nose. Sounds like the staff pointed out some ethnicity and thus diversity training was recommended. The quality was uneven, yeah. Okay. Police didn't engage. In one instance, when police had investigated, the decision that the Crown Prosecution Service would not proceed with criminal charges had taken 9 months. Grief. Communication between CPS, police, council, is reluctant at best. Okay. I agree that all of these things should be improved over time. Standard of work improved over time. Okay, so in 2009, let's skip that. Ofsted conducted a surprise review and found that social care assessments were not being completed. And existing assessments were deemed particularly weak. They weren't very good at time management. Not enough focus on CSE as other roles and responsibilities got in the way. Information was out of date, inaccurate, and managers were limited by bureaucracy. But don't worry everyone, they were given an improvement notice. They came back in 2010 and found them adequate, not exemplary. They recommended 4 different policy resources: a Young Women's Project, an LGBT group project, a sexual health project, and a nursing service. However, they're still inconsistent, inadequate, and they ignored the views of the children. The government then removed the Rotherham Children's Services in 2011, and Ofsted conducted another report. Again, adequate. The review commended senior counsellors and managers for their commitment to achieving the best outcomes for children and young people. I'm sure they were committed to it. Not that an overdose of Yes Minister has made me somewhat sceptical of certain expressions of language. Ops Central. This is the 5 convictions. Young people quite liked risky business. They seem to be the only competent advocate there. But it didn't have a computer network. And it was poorly located. They're trying to create multi-agency teams. A review team of the review team of the CSE team had been set up in a hurry at a time of considerable turmoil. So they proposed a new management structure for it. Joy. By 2013, all the staff were conscientious, enthusiastic, and focused on providing good outcomes. They had 1,700 frontline staff by 2013. Okay. Now we get to scale. It's tough stuff. No one knows the true scale of sexual exploitation in Rotherham over the years. The conservative estimate is that over 1,400 victims in the period covered by the inquiry. Again, remember that the period covered by the inquiry is 2003 to 2009 and 2009 to 2012. 2013. $1,400 plus victims. Between. Just going to go back and just make sure that it's exactly the same. 97 to 2013, they want to do it. Okay. Yeah. And I'm sure we'll update that figure later because they said that it's larger now. get back down to where we were. Right. Child victims of sexual exploitation make up a tiny proportion of contacts and referrals to children's social care, but a significant proportion of the children at serious risk of injury and harm. Even in 2014, young people told us they were reluctant to come forward for help because of shame or fear. Many more women than men have been identified as being exploited, and there was concern about under-reporting of the exploitation of young men. Some children are exposed to exploitation when they are looked after, and some exploited children are used by perpetrators to gain access to other children. It is a matter of particular concern when children are placed outside of their home area. This is a cross-boundary issue that requires clear agreements between councils. Many of the exploited children were wrongly categorised as being out-of-control children. The police did not have a category for child sexual exploitation prior to 2013. Okay. Many victims and referrals claimed they were ashamed and afraid going to authorities. This is expected to be a gross underestimate. Many children in social services were not identified as at risk of CSE due to their categorization as out of control kids. Horrendous. Estimated caseloads and contacts. So everything was growing up and up and up and up and up until 2010. Continues to be a relatively flat distribution until 2012, and then we start to see a decrease. However, the caseload inconsistencies and the contact inconsistencies for certain years, 2002, 2003, 2010, 2011, just mean that I don't think this can be trusted. So pre-2013 abused kids were classified as out of control. No. Pre-2013 abused kids were not classified at all, or if they were classified as child prostitutes, and the vast majority of kids who were at risk or being sexually exploited who were ignored were kids who were treated as out of control. Slightly different. So we know that there are, at the time of writing, 988 children known to children's social care on the police. In a randomised sample of 38 cases, there is clear evidence that a child had been a victim of sexual exploitation in 95% of files. Only 2 were at risk rather than victims, and therefore it was very probable that the vast majority of the sample size were victims. The 5% margin of error. So they read a further 28 case files, 22 of which were historic, and took place from the 3 central chart operations. 3 additional current cases were drawn, all 28 victims. All 28 victims. To help reach an overall estimate of the problem, they used the LSCB's and Council Committee's minutes of the Sexual Exploitation Forum. The inquiry concluded at least 1,400 children were sexually exploited between 1997 and 2013, a conservative estimate. It's unable to assess the numbers of other children who may have been at risk, those who were exploited but not known, and those who were forced to witness other children being assaulted and abused. During the inquiry, senior managers commented to us that CSE comprises just over 2% of total contacts and referrals to children's social care, 2.3% of safeguarding work, because they were more concerned about neglect, which is not an appropriate view. They are the most at risk, the highest proportion of the children at risk of serious injury and imminent harm. Police activity since 2012, since 2012 to 2014, they managed 18 prosecutions, 2 cautions, 9 no further actions, and a number of abduction notices. So few in such a large period of time. There was no standardised reporting of CSE, which would allow reliable judgments. A lack of standardised reporting makes the numbers almost impossible to judge. Many young people knew victims of CSE. Children were also reluctant to seek help. One person told us that gang rape was just a usual part of growing up in Rotherham. Fuck. Almost half the children who were sexually exploited are at risk, misused alcohol or other substances, part of the grooming process. A third had mental health problems, often as a result of abuse, and 2/3 had emotional health difficulties, as you would expect when you're being fucking raped in a kebab shop. There were issues of parental addiction in 1/5 of cases, and parental mental health issues in over 1/3. Barriers to accessing counselling and mental health services for children and young people were a recurrent theme. And this is a feature of current cases as well as historical. Those most at risk came from families with a parent suffering from mental illness. Over 1/3 of children abused developed and exhibited mental health issues arising from their abuse. Over 1/3 cases had a history of neglect and abuse and were well known to social services. Domestic violence is practiced on children, 46% of cases. Children went missing or were abducted in 63% of cases. We cover Looked After Children in Chapter 6. We'll see if we get there. I think I'll probably run till 5 today, guys. There was low reporting of exploitation of young males, boys, with the exception of a single conviction of an offender who abused 80 children and young men. Following the trial of the man who raped and abused 80 boys, Children's Social Care considered 2 of the 10 victims on randomly selected files to meet the threshold for social care, even though many had been raped and one was already suspected of abusing another child. None of these children was referred to risky business. One was referred to specialist counselling. One child who failed to meet the threshold for social care went on to become a serious sex offender himself and abducted and raped young girls. The inquiry team did a detailed analysis of 4 of the cases. We reviewed one teenager with a specialist team from the National Working Group Network. The importance of making sure that judgments about CSE are consistent and gender neutral by asking if the same level of risk would be acceptable if the child was the opposite sex. Supporting children to explore their sexuality in safe ways for LGBT projects. And understanding the extreme danger children put themselves in when they made contact with predatory adults because they did not know where else to find out about their sexuality. I don't know if these pages are meant to be blank. Okay. The impact of sexual exploitation on the lives of young victims was devastating, not just when they were abused, but for many years afterwards. The primary source of evidence will come from 66 case files. The minutes were often detailed from meetings of the Sexual Exploitation Forum and covered many hundreds of children and a significant number of perpetrators. There was a case where a child was doused in petrol, threatened with being set alight. Children were threatened with guns. Children who witnessed brutal and violent rapes and were threatened that they would be the next victim if they told anyone. Girls as young as 11 were raped by large numbers of male perpetrators, repeatedly, one after the other. A quote from one of the victims said, "What's the point? I might as well be dead." In 2 of the cases we read, fathers tracked down their daughters and tried to remove them from the houses where they were being abused, only to be arrested when the police were called to the scene. In the small number of cases which have already received media attention, the victims were arrested for offences such as breach of the peace, drunk and disorderly. No action was taken against the perpetrators of rape and sexual assault against the children. There are numerous historical examples of children being stalked, extreme cases of violent threats and assaults on the victims and their families. One parent who agreed to her child being placed in a residential unit to protect her wrote to Children's Social Care expressing her fears for her daughter's safety. She described her despair that instead of being protected, her child was being exposed to worse abuse than when she had been at home. My child, who was aged 13, may appear to be mature, yet some of her actions and the risks which she puts herself are those of an immature and naive person. She constantly gets drunk, mixing with older, mature adults, and refuses to be bound by the rules. One child who was being prepared to give evidence received a text saying the perpetrator had her younger sister, and the choice of what happened next was up to her. She withdrew her statements. 2 other families were terrorised by groups of perpetrators sitting in cars outside the family home, smashing windows, making abusive and threatening phone calls. On some occasions, child victims went back to perpetrators in the belief that this was the only way their parents and other children would be safe. In the most extreme cases, no one in the family believed that the authorities could protect them. Many of the victims were unable to recognise they had been groomed or exploited. Some blamed themselves, not just for their own abuse, but for what was happening to other people. There have been a small successful number of prosecutions for offences against individual children. The courage required of these children to give evidence against their attackers is commended, but the challenges cannot be underestimated. Many other children refused to give evidence or withdrew their statements as a direct result of threats, intimidation, assaults. Overall, the number of prosecutions and convictions has been disproportionate to the number of children abused and the seriousness of the offences committed against them. The process of grooming has been well documented in national reports and research. Many of the cases that we examined showed classic evidence of grooming. Many of the children were already vulnerable when grooming began. The perpetrators targeted children's residential units, residential services, and care leavers. It was not unusual for children in residential services to introduce other children to the perpetrators with statements like the following: "I know he really loves me," about a perpetrator convicted of very serious offences against other children. Many of the case files we read described children who had troubled family backgrounds, histories of domestic violence, parental addiction, and serious mental health problems in some cases. A significant number of the victims had a history of child neglect or sexual abuse when they were younger. Some had a desperate need for attention and affection, and would say things like, "He may have other girlfriends, but I'm special." This is with children as young as 11. Schools raised the alert over children as young as 11, 12 and 13 being picked up outside schools by cars and taxis that were given presents, mobile phones, and taken to meet large numbers of unknown men in Rotherham, other local towns, cities and further afield. Typically, children were courted by a young man, whom they believed to be their boyfriend. The child would then be introduced to older men who cultivated them, gifted them, gave them free alcohol and sometimes drugs. Children were initially flattered and impressed by wealth and sophistication of those who groomed them. The boys gave me drink and drugs for free. I was driven around in fast cars, is the statement. Many were utterly convinced that they were special in the affections of the perpetrator, despite all the evidence that other victims were being groomed and abused by the same person. Some children were never able to accept that they had been groomed or abused by one or more predators. A key objective of the perpetrators was to isolate the victim from families, friends, and others as part of the grooming process. They utilised mobile phones. Through the use of unguarded text and video messaging and social networking sites, children often placed themselves in a position where they were targeted, sometimes in a matter of days or hours, by predators from all over the world. In a small number of cases, this led to direct physical contact, rape, sexual abuse with one or more perpetrators. The advent of online grooming. One of the most worrying features is the ease with which young children aged 8 to 10 were targeted and exploited without their families being aware. Several social work practitioners told us that they were aware of the problem of the sexual exploitation of children from the early to mid-90s, although it was not well recognised, understood, and often described as child prostitution. Rotherham was one of the small number of places where the problem was being addressed, mainly thanks to risky business, by the looks of things. Child A, from 2000 was 12 when risk of her sexual exploitation became known. She was associated with a group of older Pakistani men, and possibly taking drugs. She disclosed having intercourse with 5 adults at age 12. 2 of these received cautions after admitting to the police they had intercourse with child A. They admitted it and were cautioned. Police were actively aware of the grooming and rape of 12-year-olds. Standard practice was to issue a caution, even with a confession. As recently as 2000 for that one. Case study. Child A continued to go missing, was at high risk of sexual exploitation. A child protection case conference was held and agreed by all that they should be registered. However, the CID representative argued against the category of sexual abuse being used because child A had been 100% consensual in every incident. It's a fucking child. This was overruled, thankfully, with all the others demonstrating a clear understanding that this was a crime and a young child was not capable of consenting. But I will mention it in there. She was supported appropriately and placed on the child protection register. Child B was referred to risky business by her school when she was 15, a little bit older, but still 15. She had been groomed by an older man involved in the exploitation of other children. Child B believed that she loved this man and believed that he loved her. He trafficked her to Leeds, Bradford and Sheffield, offered to provide her with a flat in one of those cities. A referral was made, but social care case file did not respond. This case was discussed at meetings, but no meetings of these records of these meetings have survived. Within just a few months, Child B and her family lived in fear of their lives. The windows in their house were smashed in. She and her family received threats that she would be forced into prostitution. She was assaulted by other victims at the instigation of the perpetrator. An attack on her older sibling by associates of the perpetrator resulted in him being hospitalized with serious injuries. Child B also required hospital treatment for injuries she sustained. A younger child in the family was threatened and had to go into hiding so that the perpetrators would not carry out threats against her. Child B and her mother refused to have anything more to do with the police because the police could do nothing to protect them. Child B was stalked, had petrol poured over her and was threatened with being set alight. She overdosed, and her family were too terrified to make statements to the police. She survived the overdose, by the sounds. By the time she was 18, her family broke down. She was homeless. Referred herself to social care and was given advice about benefits, but that was it. No further action was taken. Her child and her family were completely failed by all services, with the exception of risky business. Child C was 14 when sexual exploitation was identified. She was referred several times to children's social care between 2002 and 2004 because of family breakdown. Her description was out of control. Her mother voiced her concerns about Child C being sexually active, going missing, and repeated instances of severe intoxication because she had been plied with drink by older men. Several initial assessments were carried out and some familial support was offered, but the case was closed. The social worker's assessment was Child C's mother was not able to accept her growing up. In fact, she was displaying what are now known to be classic indicators of CSE from the age of 11. By the age of 13, she was at risk from violent perpetrators, associating with other victims of sexual exploitation, using drugs, and at high risk. She was referred to Risky Business, who identified these and addressed them. Child D was 13 when she was groomed by a violent sexual predator who raped and trafficked her. Her parents, Risky Business and Child D herself all understood the seriousness of this, but the police and children's social care were ineffective and blamed the child. A core assessment was done but could not be traced. They lost the file. An initial assessment accurately described the risks to Child D, but blamed her for placing herself at risk of sexual exploitation and danger. Other than Risky Business, agencies showed no comprehension that she had been groomed, that she was terrified of her perpetrators, that her attempts to placate them were themselves a symptom of serious emotional harm. Risky Business worked very hard with Child D and her parents. None of the other agencies intervened to protect her, and her parents and her had no confidence in them, understandably. We have to read these. Child E became a looked-after child when she was aged 12. She had an abusive family background and her parents had mental health problems. She was a victim of CSE when she was looked after in the local children's unit because she couldn't be protected. Her looked-after file could not be traced because, what a fucking surprise, they lost it. Although some minutes from looked-after reviews were accessed on the Risky Business file, funnily enough, the only competent and non-complicit organisation had a file. Child E was described as naive and desperate for affection, very vulnerable to coercion, was sexually exploited when a looked-after child by adult males. Oh right, she was sexually exploited when she was a looked-after child by adult males she thought were her boyfriends. Notes from the children's unit files at the time suggest that there was a chaos surrounding the care of Child E and other children in the unit, with staff powerless as older children introduced younger and more vulnerable children to predatory adult males who were targeting children's homes. Whilst looked after, she was prematurely moved into semi-independent accommodation, where, funnily enough, she became even more at risk of harm, as the report from yesterday also confirmed this was a major risk factor. They would move them into B&Bs, hostels and hotels, and they would be even more at risk. She was then admitted to a residential adolescent mental health unit after suffering psychotic episodes. There is evidence that at that point every effort was made to support her, and found a specialist foster placement at age of 16. There is some evidence of positive outcomes at that, but the longer-term outcomes are not known. Child F was a victim of serious sexual abuse when young. She was then groomed at 13, so one can presume younger than 10. She was groomed by a 27-year-old when she was 13. She was subjected to repeated rapes, sexual assaults by different perpetrators, none of whom have been brought to justice. She repeatedly threatened to kill herself, and numerous instances of serious self-harm were recorded, including overdoses and attempting to throw herself in front of cars, and why wouldn't you? Social workers worked to protect Child F after she was referred by the police. There was good cooperation between social care, police, Risky Business and acute hospital services, where doctors were concerned because of the number and seriousness of her hospital admissions. There was evidence in a file of social workers doing everything they could, frontline managers and the Risky Business workers, and she was eventually placed in secure care where she was for several months. She was kept safe and therapeutic intervention began. She was supported to return home, and the family moved out of the area, and we don't know what the outcomes were. Child G, 2007, went missing twice when she was 14. Referrals were made by the police to children's social care, but not followed up. She was groomed and raped, and there was serious concern she was at risk of suicide around the time. The case was closed thereafter, with no record of outcomes for Child G. Utterly abandoned. Child H was 11 years old when she came to the attention of the police. She disclosed that she and another child had been sexually assaulted by adult males. When she was 12, she was drunk in the back of a car with a perpetrator who had indecent photos of her on his phone. Again, no mention of what happened to that perpetrator who has demonstrable child pornography on his phone. Risky Business became involved, and the locality team did an initial assessment and closed the case. Her father provided Risky Business with all the information he had been able to obtain, and the details of where and how his daughter had been exploited and abused, and who the perpetrators were. This was passed on to the authorities around the time, 2008. She was identified as one of a group of 9 who had been associated with the perpetrator. Her case had not been allocated by Children's Social Care. The chair of the strategy meeting expressed concern and considered that she needed a child protection case conference, you don't say, but this was not held. 3 months later, the social care manager recorded on the file that child H had been assessed at no risk of sexual exploitation. She is 12, and there are photos of child pornography on the man's phone who she's with. Less than a month later, funnily enough, she was found in another house with another child and a number of adult males and arrested for being drunk and disorderly. None of the men were arrested. She was then identified as being at high risk of CSE once it's actually taken place. Funny that. Risky Business, the police and social care workers worked to support her and her father, and she was looked after for a period. She was made pregnant by her perpetrators and suffered a miscarriage while with foster carers. Her family moved out of the area and child H returned home. Some perpetrators were subsequently convicted. Child I, I'm curious how many of these we have. Looks like down to child O. Child I was 11 years old when she was raped and sexually assaulted. Her attacker was convicted. Her older sister was a victim of CSE as well. We don't know whether or not her attacker was convicted. Child I regularly went missing and was subjected to rape and sexual assaults by other older males. Became a looked-after child because of concerns for her safety, where she was further abused and exploited. She was placed out of area, went missing, trying to get back to Rotherham. This made her even more vulnerable, and she was repeatedly abused. She had PTSD, self-harmed, and at times became suicidal. At this time, she is continuing to be supported, but the trauma has resulted in lasting emotional and psychological damages. We'll end after we get to the end of these case files, because I'm not going through the rest of it today. Child J had a long history of neglect and child protection. She was 11 years old when she was at risk of CSE and was sexually abused within her family. Her older sister was a victim of sexual exploitation, and the perpetrators were successfully prosecuted. However, key information about Child J is missing from the electronic social care file. When she was 14, it was suspected that she was visiting the homes of adult male strangers and coercing other children to accompany her. A strategy meeting identified that an action needed to be taken to protect Child J, but there's no evidence that this action was ever taken. Nothing was recorded on the file about the risks she faced, despite information being held elsewhere, about the fact that she was accompanying her older sister to high-risk situations where she was exposed to exploitation. Child K was groomed by a known sex offender via Facebook when 13. She required treatment at A&E when she was taken there extremely intoxicated. Since then, there has been a pattern of high-risk behaviour, with Child K having older boyfriends who are vulnerable. That would be perpetrators and rapists, not vulnerable boyfriends. She frequents known hotspots with other young people at risk. She has been missing with other children, although her parents do not report it anymore and don't know where she is. Child K is very resistant to help, who tried hard to engage with her. Children L and M in 2012 were 2 young people from a minority ethnic community, the only ones that we have so far come across. They were part of a group of children who were at risk of sexual exploitation. Investigated as part of Op Carrington, a number of children at the same school were reported to be getting into cars with strangers and paid in return for performing sex acts. L and M frequently went missing, and their families struggled to report them missing, partly because of language difficulties, but also cultural factors. The 2 children were at high risk of exploitation. The CSE team worked hard to engage with these young people and their families to communicate the risks of CSE and to provide them with education through group work and one-to-one basis. There was an extreme difficulty of supporting children when there are major language and cultural barriers, when neither the child nor parent was willing to disclose what was happening. Child N was 12 when extremely indecent images of her were discovered on the phones of fellow students. There were suspicions that older men and one woman had groomed her via Facebook. Her family were very shocked by photos and videos that were taken of her, and have cooperated fully with the police and support offered by the CSE team. Child N was very angry that people were trying to help her, showing no understanding of the risks of online contact with strangers. She refused to disclose anything about those who had groomed and exploited her. Child O was 13 when concerns about sexual exploitation emerged. She wandered around Rotherham late at night, often in the company of an older girl, a known victim of CSE. She was found in Sheffield on one occasion, often angry and violent, and her family did not seem able to protect her. Very active on social media, acquiring many adult associates whom she perceived to be friends. She posted information online about a video where she had seen another child sexually assaulted. The perpetrator then made contact with her and threatened that if she said anything, she'd be the next victim. She was assaulted and beaten up, but neither she nor her parents disclosed this to the police. The risks to Child O were understood and documented by the CSE team, and a programme of preventative work was put in place. Nevertheless, Child O remained secretive about where she was when she was missing and whom she associated with. She continues to be at risk of exploitation. It's important to emphasise that even when agencies intervened appropriately to protect and support children and young people, the impact of sexual exploitation was devastating. These are simply examples, and not even necessarily the worst, of children being violently raped, beaten, forced to perform sex acts in taxis and cars, serially abused by large numbers of men. Many children were repeatedly self-harming, some were suicidal, many suffered family breakdowns, some became homeless. Several years after they had been abused, a disproportionate number were victims of domestic violence, developed drug and alcohol addiction, had parenting difficulties with their own children. Some suffered PTSD and other emotional and psychological problems, often undiagnosed and untreated. And some experienced mental health problems, just tacked on the end there for good measure, why not? There was very little, or no, specialist counselling or mental health intervention offered to victims despite their distress. Children were diagnosed as suffering severe PTSD. Specialist assessments identified that when a child had ongoing contact with a perpetrator, this was likely a direct result of the psychological damage that had been inflicted rather than something the victim was in control of. In a large number of cases, children and young people had pregnancies, miscarriages and terminations, abortions. Some had children removed under care orders and suffered further trauma when contact with their child was then terminated and alternative family placements found. This affected not just the victims themselves, but other siblings who had developed attachments to the child. There were often cases where vulnerable and sometimes very young mothers were able, with appropriate long-term support, to recover and successfully care for their children, but this is not likely. For the victims of sexual exploitation, the judgment of outcomes therefore has to be qualified by a recognition of what they endured, the lasting harm it has caused most of them. For the reasons given above, there are very few good outcomes to be found in the files for the victims of sexual exploitation, even when the quality of intervention was good. Right. When I put this thing together, I'm going to need to use cases like these. Because what you end up is a drip feed. Even the news sites, things like The Independent here, talking about the victims and giving examples for their 1,500 words, do not come close to examining the scale. We're going to put this together, gentlemen and ladies, And it's going to be, hopefully, something which makes a difference. But I don't think I can take any more for today. I will attempt... I'm not going to put the case studies into the document specifically, but I am going to reference where they can be found. Pages 44 to 50. The J report there. Sorry about that. We're going to have to go through the next section next time. It will probably be the weekend before I get something down. It's a very busy week for me, unfortunately. I may run something on Wednesday, but we'll see. I would hope to be able to do at least 2 of these a week. And hopefully we'll all get through it okay, because we owe it to these people who have gone through far worse. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along and going on this journey with us. I really do appreciate it. I think it's time to finish up for today. This is a long-term project. It's going to take a few months. And I'm sure this is not the worst that we're going to come across. But till then, take care, everyone. And hopefully have a great week. I'll see you all tomorrow for Fake Accents Unite, hopefully.